Hello and welcome to this Talos Threat Advisory video. My name is Hazel Burton. Today we want to talk about an increase in the rate of high sophistication attacks on network infrastructure. I'll be joined by my Cisco Talos colleagues JJ Cummings and Matt Onley to discuss the nature of these attacks and what steps defenders can take, so stay tuned. Recently, the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre released a report on a sustained campaign by a Russian intelligence agency targeting a vulnerability in routers that Cisco had published a patch for in 2017. This particular campaign is called Jaguar Tooth.
Yeah, it was a very good example of some of the broader activity that we're seeing. What happened in this case was we just had a series of incidents that we worked, a series of intelligence releases from our peers in industry that sort of indicated they were working on similar items, and also some concerning discussions with various governments around the world, and just putting some pieces together. What we were seeing is multiple sophisticated actors in kind of sustained campaigns going after router infrastructure in a similar ways. And they were targeting a variety of different devices, but they were certainly being most successful on end-of-life hardware, out-of-date software sort of device.
Now, not only did Jaguar Tooth involve the exploit of a vulnerability from 2017, it was what we call a post-auth vulnerability, which means that the attackers had already obtained legitimate credentials in order to be able to access the router. In this case, it was due to poorly selected SNMP community strings, which were relatively easy for the attacker to guess. So what happens next if the attacker gains access to the network infrastructure? What are some of the goals of these particular attackers?
From that compromise, the threat actor is then building increasing levels of access and visibility for themselves, and even levels of persistence, frankly, in some cases, into then network infrastructure devices for a wide variety of reasons that we've seen. Primarily, those reasons include, though, espionage. Certainly, we've seen other cases which may involve other goals from a strategic perspective. In other environments, they're not taking overt espionage actions as far as we can tell, but they are in a position where they could definitely cause havoc. In some cases, there are places of international strategic importance for some of the conflict areas that we're concerned about. Like actors aren't in places, particularly these kind of actors aren't in places for no reason, and so we have to make a determination about what they're doing, sort of what they're after, what they're looking for, and our best determination in some of these cases that they're pre-positioning because it would be of strategic value to somebody for these things to be offline in future conflicts. One of the interesting things out of that report, if you kind of click through it and get to the description of the actual Jaguar Tooth malware that was used, this memory resident malware, and describing exactly what they do, it's very indicative of the kind of first steps that actors take to understand your environment. So they did a show config, they did a show interface, they did a show route, they did a show ARP table, they did a show CDP neighbor. And all of these are giving them a picture from that router's perspective of the network, and they're getting an understanding of what foothold they have so they can make their next decisions. And just that activity has generated a lot of discussions on our side about just how important it is for defenders to understand their environment, because once the actor is in place, then it's a race to see who understands the environment better.
So let's talk about what happens in that scenario. What are the typical steps that a threat actor might take, and therefore, what are the things to look out for?
The threat actor identifies who the network operations folks are and who should be allowed to connect to a device. They then connect to that device using those credentials. This is where it changes, though. Then they start to do things that user doesn't typically do, or that environment doesn't typically have, right? They turn certain features on in order to allow them then to exploit one of the one of these post-authentication CVEs that we've been talking about, right? So all of these things led up to this event occurring, and in a number of cases, if appropriate monitoring, if appropriate auditing were in place, presumably they would have been caught early on before they could get so far embedded that they can then control the logging. But other things that we've seen are modifications of access lists, right, to allow for bad guys to connect from the outside into a device directly, so they don't have to go through the inside of the network, right? Certainly, the goal there is if they get detected from inside the network, then they want to be able to connect from the outside. It's just another mechanism of persistence, allowing them that access.
Given that the Jaguar tooth example concerns a router vulnerability that was announced several years ago and a patch was issued for it straight away, you may be wondering why those routers remained vulnerable within the organizations that were attacked for so long. Well, the answer is often not that simple. So I asked Matt and JJ to give me their takes on some of the main operational barriers that slow down or in some cases stop security teams from properly being able to secure network infrastructure.
But when I start to think about network operations teams, and those are the teams who are responsible for managing and maintaining this infrastructure, their primary mission, right, what they are frankly the most incentivized to do, is to maintain a high level of availability and uptime. And in doing so, I think that often what we see is this mentality of if it's not broken, I'm not going to fix it, right? And so as such, we see things remaining unpatched for long periods of time. We see devices which have been end of life for considerable lengths of time staying in place because they keep running. I think this is a great testament, certainly to Cisco equipment and frankly to the equipment of other vendors as well, right? These devices are able to stay up and running for long periods of time and to do so in a stable way. And so I think that a couple of things need to kind of fundamentally shift here. Even when I look at how these devices are monitored by the network operations teams, the things that they're looking for are indicators that and metrics that show them uptime and availability and anything that might risk that, as opposed to bad guy doing bad guy thing on the device.
Our response, I guess, was to write the blog, to do this video, to talk to reporters, to try to reinforce for defenders that, hey, these pieces of high-performing, high availability silicon need to be watched in kind of a special way. And there's some recommendations in the blog post in terms of what to do in terms of configuration management and net flow monitoring, et cetera. And some examples of what you might see actors doing. But it's just another, it's another layer on top of an already exhausted security team. Like, hey, you have to watch this too, and you have to do these things as well.
Absolutely. Do check out the Talos blog, which has some solid recommendations for what to do to try and prevent these kind of attacks happening on your network. These are things like setting complex community strings for SNMP, encrypting all monitoring and configuration traffic, locking down and aggressively monitoring all credential systems, and also monitoring your environment for unusual behavior or configurations.
And part of that is understanding how your environment's built, how it performs, and then building systems to catch when things will depart that norm. And so, for example, one of the things that we've seen actors do is build these GRE tunnels, these encrypted tunnels out of the router, and they can then route traffic across that. And so in one case, we saw it redirecting all DNS traffic for this critical infrastructure environment out to this server in Germany where they can inspect it or replace it or change it or respond to it however they wanted to handle it. And so, but that GRE tunnel will show up in a NetFlow monitoring environment as a completely different protocol that you can say, hey, is this something that we normally have? The configuration in the router itself will show up. So if you're doing config monitoring, you can say, where did this GRE tunnel configuration tunnel come? So it's that sort of things. And we acknowledge, in the blog, like that's a super hard
high maturity security environments are a thing to do. But when you're dealing with the level of sophistication of actors that we're talking about, you have to build an environment that is hostile to their presence. And that's part of that process.
Certainly, once the adversary in these cases has gotten so far down the path and hasn't been observed that they've placed malicious code in memory, then kind of all bets are off from a certain perspective, from a basic monitoring perspective, because then the bad guy has the ability to control what is and is not being logged from the device.
Other than checking out the blog for more analysis on these type of attacks, Matt has some advice for you on what to do if you are experiencing a security incident of this nature.
These are specialized environments, so if you're having a security incident that kind of involves this gear, you should bring in your vendor, whoever that is. If it's Cisco or if it's another routing vendor or another firewall vendor, bring that vendor in, because they will be able to provide you assistance in kind of like the forensics piece of trying to understand what you're seeing.
If it's a Cisco device, there is a place to go to report any issues, and that is through our PCERT team. All the information to get in touch with them is on the blog. And lastly, just to reinforce what Matt and JJ said, we know that there are a myriad of operational realities that make it difficult to maintain a fully defensible network infrastructure. But given the risks and the outcomes that we talked about in this video, these obstacles must be overcome in order for organizations to truly secure their environments. So our recommendation is to work closely with your vendor in order to give yourself the best possible chance to defend your network. Thank you for watching.